Hi, I'm Natalie Brooks. 3 months ago, I was sleeping on a concrete slab next to raw sewage, while my family ate dinner 15 feet above my head. Today, I own the largest waste management empire in the Midwest, and my parents work for minimum wage at a gas station because I bought the company that employed them and had them both fired. My brother Tyler begged me for a job last week. I hung up on him. But that's not even the most satisfying part. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The most satisfying part is that everything I built came from the uncle they told me was dead for 23 years. The uncle who left me $12 million and 3 operational waste treatment facilities. The uncle whose funeral they attended while I was locked in a basement, covered in filth, wondering if I'd ever see sunlight again. So what do you think happened when I walked into that lawyer's office and discovered my family had been lying to me my entire life? The smell never leaves you. That's what people don't understand about living next to a septic tank. It gets into your hair, your clothes, your skin. It becomes part of who you are until you can't tell where the stench ends and you begin. I learned that lesson at 14 when my father decided I was old enough to understand my place in the Brooks family hierarchy. We lived on 40 acres outside Millbrook, Ohio, where the cornfields stretched for miles, and nobody asked questions about what happened behind closed doors. The Brooks family had been in waste management for 3 generations, though you'd never know it from how we lived. Our house was a sprawling ranch that looked impressive from the road but fell apart the moment you stepped inside. Peeling wallpaper, water stains on every ceiling, and a basement that flooded every spring with a mixture of rainwater and whatever backed up from our failing septic system. My father, Richard Brooks, was a man who measured his worth by how much pain he could inflict on others. He stood 6'3" with hands like sledgehammers and a voice that could crack windows when he raised it. He worked at Henderson Manufacturing downtown, supervising a crew of guys who were terrified to look him in the eye. But at home, his real power came from making sure I knew exactly how worthless I was compared to my older brother Tyler. Tyler was everything I wasn't. Tall like Dad, confident, charming when he needed T33OB. He played varsity football, dated the homecoming queen, and had already been accepted to Ohio State on a partial scholarship. My mother, Linda, worshipped the ground he walked on. She was a thin woman with nervous energy who spent most of her time chain-smoking Virginia Slims and finding new ways to remind me that I was an accident, a mistake, a burden they never wanted but were stuck with. I was 17 when the septic tank incident happened, though the groundwork had been laid years earlier. You see, the Brooks family had a tradition of teaching children respect through humiliation. When I was 12, I'd been locked in the hall closet for 3 days for talking back. When I was 15, I'd been forced to eat dog food for dinner because I'd forgotten to take out the trash. But the septic tank was different. The septic tank was where they sent me when they wanted me to disappear entirely. It started on a Tuesday in October. I remember because it was picture day at school, and I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. I'd saved up money from my part-time job at the local diner to buy a new sweater, something that would make me look normal, maybe even pretty. I came home that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in months, ready to show my parents the preliminary photos the school had taken. Tyler was in the kitchen when I walked in, still wearing his football uniform, grass stains on his knees from practice. He was eating a sandwich my mother had made for him, thick slices of turkey and cheese on fresh bread, the kind of meal I never got. I set my backpack down and pulled out the photo envelope, my hands shaking slightly with excitement. "Look," I said, holding up the photos. "I think they turned out really well." My mother glanced over from where she was washing Tyler's practice gear in the sink. Her expression shifted immediately from indifference to disgust. "What is that thing you're wearing?" I looked down at my sweater, the one I'd been so proud of. "It's new. I bought it with my own money." "You look like a tramp," she said, her voice flat. "No daughter of mine is going to school looking like that." Tyler laughed, a sound like broken glass. "She looks like she's trying too hard. It's embarrassing." That's when my father walked in from the garage, oil stains on his work shirt, his face already dark with whatever anger he'd been carrying all day. He took one look at me standing there with my photos and my new sweater, and something shifted in his eyes. "What's this?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "School pictures," I said quietly, suddenly wishing I'd never come home. He snatched the photos from my hands, studying them with the same expression he'd used to examine a piece of rotten meat. Then he started laughing, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that made your blood run cold. "You actually thought you looked good in these?" he asked, holding them up for Tyler and my mother to see. "Look at this. Our daughter thinks she's some kind of model." Tyler leaned over to look at the photos, grinning. "Oh wow, that's actually hilarious. She really thought that sweater would help." My mother joined in, her laugh sharp and cruel. "I told you she looked like a tramp. Now the whole school's gonna see it." I felt my face burning with shame, but I tried to stand my ground. "I don't look like a tramp. I look normal. I look nice." The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. My father's hand connected with my cheek with enough force to spin me around, and I stumbled into the kitchen counter, knocking over Tyler's glass of milk. "Don't you ever talk back to your mother?" my father snarled, stepping closer to me. "And don't you ever embarrass this family again by thinking you're something you're not?" I should have apologized. I should have cleaned up the milk and gone to my room and pretended it never happened. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way Tyler was smirking at me, or the way my mother was nodding in approval, or maybe it was just 17 years of swallowing my pride finally catching up to me. "I'm not embarrassing anyone," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "I'm trying to be normal, I'm trying to fit in, and you're all acting like that's some kind of crime." The silence that followed was worse than the slap had been. My father's face went completely still, and I knew immediately that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. "You want to be normal?" he asked quietly. "You want to fit in?" I nodded, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "Then maybe it's time you learned what normal families do with children who don't appreciate what they have," he continued, his voice getting lower and more dangerous with each word. "Tyler, go get the keys to the shed." Tyler's grin widened. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was excited about it. He jogged outside while my father grabbed me by the arm, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. "Please," I whispered, but he wasn't listening anymore. He dragged me through the kitchen, past my mother who was already cleaning up the spilled milk like nothing was happening, out the back door and across the yard to where Tyler was waiting by a small concrete structure I'd always assumed was some kind of storage building. It wasn't a storage building, it was a pump house for our septic system, and underneath the concrete slab was a crawl space that connected directly to the septic tank itself. Tyler had unlocked a metal grate I'd never noticed before, revealing a dark hole that smelled like every nightmare you'd ever had about being buried alive. "This is where children go when they forget to be grateful," my father said, shoving me toward the opening. "Maybe a night down there will help you remember your place." I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Tyler helped him force me down into the crawl space, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls as they slammed the grate shut above my head. I heard the lock click into place, and then their footsteps walking away, leaving me alone in the dark with the sound of raw sewage flowing just inches from where I crouched. The space was maybe 4 feet high and 6 feet long, just big enough for me to lie down if I curled into a ball. The floor was damp concrete that had been stained black by years of leaks and overflow. The smell was indescribable, like death and chemicals and human waste all mixed together into something that made your eyes water and your throat close up. I spent that first night crying, partly from the smell and partly from the humiliation of being treated like an animal. I could hear them through the thin concrete above me, laughing at something on television, Tyler telling some story about football practice while my mother made dinner. Normal family sounds, happening 15 feet above my head while I crouched in filth like I wasn't even human.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They brought me a bologna sandwich and a bottle of water the next morning, sliding them through a slot in the grate I hadn't noticed in the dark. My father's face appeared above me, looking down like I was some kind of zoo animal. "Have you learned your lesson?" he asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to apologize and beg to be let out and promise I'd never talk back again, but when I opened my mouth, what came out was, "This is insane. You can't keep me down here." His expression didn't change, but he slid the grate shut without another word. I didn't see daylight again for 3 days. By the time they finally let me out, I was a different person. I'd spent 72 hours breathing in sewage fumes and listening to my family live their lives without me, and something fundamental had broken inside me. Not in a way that made me weaker, but in a way that made me realize I didn't belong to them anymore. I belonged to myself, and someday I was going to make them pay for every minute I'd spent in that hole. They made me sleep down there every time I did something they didn't like. Forgot to do the dishes, got a B instead of an A, wore something they thought was inappropriate, spoke when I hadn't been spoken to. Tyler started suggesting it as punishment for things that weren't even rule violations, just because he enjoyed watching me disappear. "She's getting too uppity again," he'd say when I walked into a room. "Maybe she needs some time to think." And down I'd go, sometimes for one night, sometimes for a week, depending on their mood and how much they enjoyed having me gone. I learned to keep spare clothes hidden outside, to brush my teeth in the creek behind our property, to shower at school before first period so the other kids wouldn't smell the septic tank on me. I also learned to be invisible. I stopped participating in class discussions, stopped raising my hand, stopped trying to make friends. I worked extra shifts at the diner and saved every penny, not because I had a plan, but because I knew someday I'd need money to escape. I became a ghost in my own life, floating through days and weeks without making any noise that might remind them I existed. But I also started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Like how my parents always seemed to have more money than they should, given that my father worked at a factory and my mother didn't work at all. Like how they'd get mysterious phone calls late at night that made my father pace around the house with a worried expression. Like how they'd sometimes drive out to the industrial part of town and come back hours later without explaining where they'd been. Most importantly, I started listening when they thought I couldn't hear them. And that's how I learned about Uncle Harold. Uncle Harold was my father's older brother, and according to the whispered conversations I caught pieces of, he owned a successful waste management company that serviced most of the industrial district. He was also, apparently, the reason my father was able to afford our house and Tyler's car and all the other things that didn't match up with a factory worker's salary. "Harold's getting suspicious," I heard my mother say one night when she thought I was asleep. "He keeps asking about Natalie, why she never comes to family gatherings, why we never talk about her." "She's not his business," my father replied, but there was worry in his voice. "She's our daughter. We'll handle her how we see fit." "He threatened to cut us off if he doesn't see her soon," my mother continued. "You know what that means. No more monthly checks. No more help with Tyler's college." That's when I understood. Uncle Harold had been supporting our family financially, probably for years, and he'd been asking about me. My parents had been taking his money while keeping me locked in a septic tank, and now he was starting to ask questions they couldn't answer. 2 weeks later, I overheard my father on the phone with someone, his voice hushed but urgent. "We need more time," he was saying. "Just tell him she's been sick. Tell him she's been visiting relatives. Tell him anything, but we need those payments to continue." The next morning at breakfast, my father made an announcement. Uncle Harold was going to be visiting next month, and I was going to be sent to stay with my mother's sister in Cleveland until he left. "Why?" Tyler asked, though his grin suggested he already knew the answer. "Because Uncle Harold has some old-fashioned ideas about how children should be treated," my father said, glancing at me like I was a problem that needed to be managed. "And we don't need him getting the wrong impression about our family." That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized this was my chance. If Uncle Harold was coming to see me, and if my parents were so desperate to hide me from him that they were willing to send me away, then maybe Uncle Harold was the one person in our family who might actually care what happened to me. I started planning my escape that very night. I had 2 weeks to figure out how to get to Uncle Harold before my parents could ship me off to Cleveland. 2 weeks to gather enough evidence to prove what they'd been doing to me. 2 weeks to find a way to contact the one person who might actually listen. I didn't know it then, but Uncle Harold had been looking for me for months. He'd been sending my parents money specifically earmarked for my care and education, and when they kept making excuses for why he couldn't see me, he'd started getting suspicious. He'd even hired a private investigator to look into our family's finances, trying to figure out where all the money he'd been sending was actually going. What I also didn't know was that Uncle Harold had been keeping detailed records of every payment he'd made to my parents, every conversation they'd had about me, every excuse they'd given for my absence. He'd been building a case against them for months, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came sooner than any of us expected. 3 days before Uncle Harold was supposed to visit, my father came home from work in the worst mood I'd ever seen him in. He'd been fired from Henderson Manufacturing for showing up drunk, and my mother was hysterical about how they were going to pay the bills without his income. "This is all your fault," my father snarled at me when he saw me doing homework at the kitchen table. "If we didn't have to worry about hiding you from Harold, I could focus on my job instead of dealing with your drama." "I'm just sitting here," I said quietly, not looking up from my textbook. "Don't give me attitude," he snapped, grabbing my arm and yanking me out of the chair. "You think you can just sit there being useless while this family falls apart?" Tyler appeared in the doorway, still wearing his Letterman jacket from school. "Maybe she needs some time to think about how she's contributing to the family's problems," he suggested, with that familiar cruel smile. My father nodded, already dragging me toward the back door. "Good idea. A few days in your special room might help you develop some perspective." But this time was different. This time, when they shoved me down into the septic crawl space and locked the grate above my head, I wasn't crying. I was planning. I'd been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks, and I finally had everything I needed to change my life forever. Hidden in my jacket pocket was a small digital camera I'd bought with money from the diner. Over the past few weeks, I'd been documenting everything: the septic tank setup, the lock on the grate, the conditions inside the crawl space. I'd also been keeping a detailed journal of every time they'd forced me down there, every conversation I'd overheard about Uncle Harold, every detail about the money they'd been receiving. As I sat in that concrete hole, listening to them laugh about something on television above me, I took photograph after photograph. The stained walls, the standing water, the sewage pipes, just inches from where I was forced to sleep. I documented everything, knowing that soon I'd have a chance to show someone who might actually care. What I didn't know was that Uncle Harold was already on his way to Ohio, and he wasn't planning to give my parents any warning before he arrived. Uncle Harold arrived on a Thursday morning while I was supposed to be locked in the septic crawl space. I'd been down there for 6 days this time, surviving on stale bread and warm water, documenting everything with my hidden camera when the concrete above me suddenly started vibrating with heavy footsteps. I could hear voices through the thin barrier between me and the world above. My father's voice, higher pitched than usual, nervous in a way I'd never heard before. Then another voice, deeper, more authoritative, asking questions that made my father stammer. "Where is she, Richard? Where's Natalie?" She's visiting Linda's sister in Cleveland. School trip. Educational opportunity. For 3 weeks? During the middle of the semester?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the concrete walls. Then Uncle Harold spoke again, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of running a successful business. "Richard, I've been sending you money specifically for Natalie's care and education for the past 5 years. $1,200 a month. Every month. With the understanding that you were providing her with everything she needed. I've asked to see her dozens of times, and you've given me a different excuse every single time. Harold, you don't understand how difficult she's been. The attitude problems, the behavioral issues. We've been doing our best, but show me her room." Those 4 words cut through my father's excuses like a blade. I pressed my ear against the concrete, straining to hear what came next. Footsteps moving through the house, doors opening and closing, my mother's voice joining the conversation with her usual nervous chatter about how hard it was to raise a troubled teenager. "This is it?" Uncle Harold's voice was ice cold now. "This closet is where my niece sleeps?" I realized they were showing him my actual bedroom, which was barely larger than the crawl space I was currently trapped in. A converted storage room with no windows, furnished with a twin mattress on the floor and a plastic dresser from Walmart. Even by the Brooks family standards, it was obviously inadequate for a 17-year-old girl. "She prefers smaller spaces," my mother said weakly. "She's always been claustrophobic about large rooms." "Where are her belongings? Her clothes, her books, her personal items? The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. I could hear my parents scrambling for answers, their voices getting more defensive and desperate with each passing minute. Tyler had apparently made himself scarce, probably recognizing that his usual charm wouldn't work on Uncle Harold. "I want to see financial records," Uncle Harold said finally. "Bank statements, receipts, documentation of how the money I've been sending has been spent on Natalie's behalf." "Now, Harold, that's really not necessary." "It's absolutely necessary. I've been sending you over $70,000 over the past 5 years, and I'm looking at a house that shows no evidence that any of it was spent on the child it was intended for." $70,000. I gripped my camera tighter, my mind racing. Uncle Harold had been sending my parents $70,000 specifically for me, and I'd been sleeping in a converted closet and eating bologna sandwiches while Tyler got everything he wanted. The argument continued above me, voices rising and falling like a storm passing overhead. I could hear Uncle Harold demanding explanations, my parents offering increasingly frantic justifications, the sound of papers being shuffled and phone calls being made. At one point, I heard him say something about calling the police, and my mother actually started crying. That's when everything changed. "What's that smell?" Uncle Harold asked suddenly, and the house went completely quiet. I held my breath, knowing that the septic system had been backing up more frequently lately, probably because of all the rain we'd been having. The smell of raw sewage was something my family had learned to ignore, but to an outsider, it would be immediately noticeable. "Old pipes," my father said quickly. "We've been meaning to get them looked at." "That's not old pipes, Richard. That's raw sewage. Where is it coming from?" I could hear them moving around the house, Uncle Harold, following the smell, while my parents tried to distract him with increasingly desperate explanations. When the footsteps approached the back door, I knew my hiding place was about to be discovered. The door opened, and I could hear them walking across the yard toward the pump house. My father was talking fast now, something about municipal water problems and drainage issues, but Uncle Harold wasn't listening anymore. "What's this structure?" he asked, and I knew he was standing directly above me. "Just a utility building. Storage for lawn equipment. It's connected to your septic system." "Well, yes, but..." The sound of the metal grate being examined made my heart race. I could hear Uncle Harold trying the lock, testing the hinges, asking questions about why a storage building would need to be locked from the outside. "Richard, open this." "I don't have the key with me." "Tyler must have it somewhere." "Open it now, or I'm calling the police." The silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then I heard my father's heavy footsteps walking back toward the house, presumably to get the key he'd claimed he didn't have. When the grate finally opened, sunlight poured into my concrete prison like a revelation. I squinted up through the opening and saw a man I didn't recognize, looking down at me with an expression of absolute horror. Uncle Harold was tall like my father, but everything else about him was different. His hair was silver instead of black, his face was kind instead of cruel, and his clothes suggested success rather than barely controlled anger. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring down at me. "Natalie?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. I'd been down there for 6 days, and the combination of sewage fumes and dehydration had left me weak and disoriented. "How long have you been down there?" 6 days this time, I managed to croak out. "This time?" His voice cracked on the words. "How many times have they done this to you?" Before I could answer, my father appeared at Uncle Harold's shoulder, his face pale and panicked. "Harold, I can explain. She's been having behavioral problems, and we needed a way to..." Uncle Harold spun around so fast, my father actually took a step backward. "You put a child in a septic tank? Your own daughter? It's not what it looks like. It looks like child abuse. It looks like the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my entire life." Uncle Harold reached down to help me out of the crawl space, his hands gentle but urgent. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, my legs cramped from days of being unable to fully stretch out. The smell that rose from my clothes made him recoil slightly, but he didn't let go of me. "We're leaving," he said firmly, keeping one arm around my shoulders while he faced down my parents. "Natalie is coming with me right now." "You can't just take her," my mother protested, appearing beside my father with tears streaming down her face. "She's our daughter. You have no legal right." "I have a legal right to report child abuse when I see it," Uncle Harold replied coldly. "And I have a moral obligation to get this child away from the people who've been torturing her." Tyler chose that moment to reappear, probably drawn by the sound of shouting. He took one look at me standing there covered in filth, and Uncle Harold's furious expression, and his usual cocky demeanor evaporated. "Tyler," Uncle Harold said, his voice deadly quiet, "did you know about this?" Tyler glanced at our parents, clearly calculating whether honesty or denial would serve him better. "I mean, I knew she got sent down there sometimes, but you knew your sister was being forced to sleep in a septic tank, and you did nothing to stop it?" "It wasn't my job to stop it," Tyler said defensively. "I'm not her parent." Uncle Harold stared at him for a long moment, and I could see him making mental notes about each member of my family, cataloging their responses, building a case in his mind. "Get in the car, Natalie," he said without taking his eyes off Tyler. "We're going to my house, and then we're going to figure out how to make sure this never happens to you again." I started walking toward his car, a black Mercedes that looked like it belonged in a different universe from our rural Ohio nightmare. Behind me, I could hear my parents trying to negotiate, offering compromises and explanations, promising things would be different if I just stayed. Uncle Harold wasn't interested in their promises. He helped me into the passenger seat, his face grim as he took in my appearance up close. My clothes were stained and reeking, my hair was matted with substances I didn't want to identify, and I probably looked like I'd been living underground for months. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, starting the engine while my parents stood in the driveway looking stunned. "Not physically," I said, though my voice was still hoarse from breathing septic fumes. "We're going to fix this," he promised, backing out of the driveway while my father shouted something about legal rights and family business. "I'm going to make sure they never hurt you again." The drive to Uncle Harold's house took 45 minutes, during which I learned more about my family's finances than I'd known in 17 years of living with them. Uncle Harold explained that he'd been sending monthly payments to my parents since I was 12, money that was supposed to cover my food, clothing, education, and medical care. He'd also been depositing money into a college fund that was supposed to be accumulating interest for my future. "The college fund has over $40,000 in it," he told me as we drove through Columbus toward his neighborhood. "Money that's been sitting there waiting for you to turn 18 and claim it." "They never told me about any college fund," I said, staring out the window at suburbs that looked like something from a magazine. Quote, "They never told you about a lot of things," Uncle Harold replied grimly, "including the fact that I've been trying to visit you for years." His house was everything my family's home wasn't. Clean, modern, comfortable without being ostentatious. He showed me to a guest room with an actual bed, a real dresser, and a bathroom that didn't smell like a sewage treatment plant. "Take a shower," he said kindly. "Take as long as you need. There are clean clothes in the dresser that should fit you, and when you're ready, we'll talk about what happens next." I spent 2 hours in that shower, washing away 6 days of accumulated filth and 17 years of accumulated shame. When I finally emerged, I found clean jeans and a sweater laid out on the bed, along with underwear and socks that still had tags on them. Uncle Harold was waiting in the kitchen with a plate of actual food, the kind of meal I'd forgotten existed. Grilled chicken, fresh vegetables, bread that wasn't stale, and a glass of cold milk that tasted like luxury. "Tell me everything," he said once I'd eaten enough to stop feeling lightheaded. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." So I did. I told him about the septic tank, about Tyler's cruelty, about my parents' systematic destruction of my self-worth. I showed him the photographs I'd been taking, the documentation I'd been keeping, the evidence I'd been gathering without really knowing why. Uncle Harold listened to everything without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs on his phone screen. "Natalie," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. What your parents did to you wasn't discipline. It wasn't even abuse in the traditional sense. It was torture. They tortured you for years while taking money that was meant to help you." I nodded, finally hearing someone say what I'd known in my heart but had never been able to articulate. "I'm going to make sure they face consequences for what they've done," he continued. "But first, I want to make sure you're safe and that you understand your options." That's when he explained about his business, Brooks Environmental Solutions, which had grown from a small local waste management company into a multi-million-dollar operation serving industrial clients across 3 states. He was 62 years old, had never married, had no children of his own, and had been planning to leave everything to me when he died. "But given what I've discovered today," he said, "I think it's time to accelerate that timeline." Over the next 3 hours, Uncle Harold laid out a plan that would change my life forever. He wanted me to come work for him immediately, learning the business from the ground up while finishing my education through a private tutor. He wanted to formalize my inheritance, making sure I had legal protection and financial independence. Most importantly, he wanted to make sure my parents faced consequences for what they'd done to me. "They've been committing fraud for 5 years, he explained, showing me financial records on his laptop. "Taking money under false pretenses, filing false reports about your well-being, potentially tax evasion depending on how they've been categorizing the payments." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they're going to prison," he said simply. "And Tyler, if we can prove he was complicit, will face charges as well." That night I slept in a real bed for the first time in months. No smell of sewage, no concrete walls, no fear that someone would drag me out in the middle of the night for some imagined transgression. Just clean sheets, a soft mattress, and the sound of Uncle Harold making phone calls in his office down the hall. I could hear fragments of his conversations through the walls. Words like, quote, "criminal charges," and "child protective services," and "full investigation." He was building a case against my family with the same methodical precision he'd used to build his business empire. The next morning, he took me to his office, a gleaming building in the industrial district that housed Brooks Environmental Solutions. The lobby was impressive, with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the treatment facilities. This was where my family's money had actually come from, I realized. Not my father's factory job or my mother's non-existent career, but Uncle Harold's success in an industry that most people preferred not to think about. "Waste management is unglamorous," Uncle Harold explained as he showed me around the facilities. "But it's essential, and that makes it profitable. People will always need someone to deal with their garbage, their sewage, their industrial waste. If you do it efficiently and legally, you can build an empire." He introduced me to his employees as his niece and heir apparent, explaining that I'd be learning the business while finishing my education. The workers were uniformly respectful, clearly aware that Uncle Harold was someone who commanded loyalty as well as fear. "The key to this business," he told me as we toured the treatment plants, "is understanding that you're not just managing waste, you're managing relationships. With municipal governments, with industrial clients, with regulatory agencies. You're solving problems that other people can't or won't solve." By the end of that first week, I'd learned more about business operations than I'd learned about anything in 17 years of public education. Uncle Harold was a patient teacher, explaining everything from basic accounting to complex environmental regulations. He also made sure I understood the legal proceedings that were beginning against my parents. "The district attorney is very interested in this case," he told me over dinner on Friday night. "Financial fraud involving a minor, especially with the abuse component, is something they take seriously." "What's going to happen to them?" I asked. "That depends on how cooperative they are," Uncle Harold replied. "If they plead guilty and make restitution, they might avoid prison time. If they try to fight it, they'll probably spend the next several years in county lockup." I thought about Tyler, probably sitting in his room right now wondering how his perfect life had suddenly imploded. I thought about my mother, crying into her cigarettes while she tried to figure out how to explain this to her sister. I thought about my father, his authority crumbling as the legal system he'd always dismissed as irrelevant suddenly became the most important thing in his world. For the first time in my life, I felt something that took me a while to recognize. It wasn't just relief or gratitude or even satisfaction, it was power. The power that comes from knowing that the people who hurt you are finally going to face consequences, and that you're the one who gets to decide what those consequences look like. Uncle Harold had given me more than just rescue. He'd given me the tools to build a life where I'd never be powerless again. And as I sat in his comfortable house, eating real food and planning my future, I started to understand that this was just the beginning. My family thought they'd broken me. Instead, they'd just given me motivation to become everything they'd never imagined I could be. 3 months into living with Uncle Harold, I was managing the night shift at our largest treatment facility when my father showed up demanding to see me. I watched him through the security cameras as he argued with our gate guard, his face red with the kind of rage I remembered from childhood. The difference was that now I had 24-hour security, legal representation, and a restraining order that made his presence a criminal offense. "Call the police," I told Jake Morrison, our head of security and former Columbus police detective. "Let them handle this." Jake nodded and reached for his radio, but I stopped him. Something about seeing my father reduced to shouting at a security gate made me realize how completely the power dynamic had shifted. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't even reach me. "Actually, let him in," I said. "But keep the cameras rolling and stay close." The man who walked into my office looked nothing like the terrifying figure who had dominated my childhood. Richard Brooks was smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched with defeat, his clothes cheaper than I remembered. The factory job was gone, the house was gone, and according to the court documents I'd been receiving, his marriage was hanging by a thread. "Natalie," he said, his voice lacking the authority it once carried. "We need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from my desk without getting up. The office was Uncle Harold's design, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that communicated success without apology. Behind me, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the treatment facility where millions of gallons of industrial waste were processed every day, generating revenue that would have been incomprehensible to the man who used to lock me in a septic tank. "What do you want, Richard?" I asked, deliberately avoiding the word father. He flinched at my tone but pressed forward. "I want to make this right. Your mother and we've been talking, and we realize we made some mistakes." "Mistakes?" I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "Is that what you're calling it now?" "We were under a lot of pressure back then," he continued, his voice taking on the wheedling quality he'd always used when he wanted something. "Money was tight, Tyler had college expenses, your mother was dealing with her own issues. We didn't handle things the way we should have." I let the silence stretch out between us, watching him squirm under the weight of his own inadequate explanations. Through the office intercom, I could hear the steady hum of machinery processing waste into profit, a sound that had become as comforting to me as a heartbeat. "The district attorney has a different word for what you did," I said finally. "They call it criminal child abuse. They also call it fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against a minor." His face went pale. "Natalie, you don't understand the position you're putting us in. If this goes to trial, if we get convicted, we'll lose everything. The house, Tyler's education, your mother's health insurance, everything." "You already lost everything," I replied calmly. "The house has been foreclosed on. Tyler dropped out of college when the money stopped coming. Your wife filed for divorce last week." The last part wasn't entirely true yet, but I'd seen the papers Linda Brooks had asked her lawyer to prepare. Uncle Harold's investigators were thorough, and they kept me informed about every development in my former family's ongoing collapse. Richard's composure cracked completely. "You're destroying us. Your own family. Over what? Some discipline that got out of hand? Some money that was always going to be yours anyway?" That's when I stood up, my hands flat on the desk surface, leaning forward so he could see exactly how much I'd changed since the last time we'd spoken. "Over torture," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Over 17 years of systematic abuse disguised as parenting. Over $70,000 stolen from money Uncle Harold sent specifically for my care. Over watching you beat me while your son applauded and your wife laughed." He tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. "But mostly, Richard, I'm doing this because I can. Because for the first time in my life I have power and you don't. Because Uncle Harold taught me that the waste management business is really about cleaning up messes that other people create, and you three are the biggest mess I've ever seen. The door to my office opened, and Uncle Harold walked in with Marcus Rivera, the attorney who'd been handling our case against my parents. Both men looked at Richard with the kind of professional contempt reserved for people who abuse children and steal money meant for their care. "Mr. Brooks," Marcus said pleasantly, "I wasn't aware you were planning to violate the restraining order tonight." Richard's face went from pale to ashen. "I didn't think it applied if she agreed to see me. It applies everywhere, all the time, until a judge says otherwise," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. "Which makes this visit a criminal offense punishable by up to 6 months in county jail." Uncle Harold stepped forward, his presence filling the room in a way that made Richard shrink back toward the door. "Unless, of course, you're here to discuss the plea agreement my attorney proposed last week." That's when I understood why Uncle Harold had let this meeting happen. He'd been expecting Richard to show up eventually, driven by desperation to try one last manipulation. The plea agreement was sitting on Marcus's desk, a document that would allow my parents to avoid prison time in exchange for full restitution, public admission of guilt, and permanent surrender of any parental rights. "I can't sign that," Richard said desperately. "The restitution alone would bankrupt us." "You're already bankrupt," I pointed out. "The question is whether you want to be bankrupt and free, or bankrupt and in prison." Marcus set a folder on my desk and opened it to reveal financial documents that painted a clear picture of my parents' situation. Assets seized, accounts frozen, credit destroyed. The legal fees alone had consumed what little they had left after Uncle Harold stopped sending money. "Your son Tyler has already agreed to testify against you," Marcus said conversationally. "Apparently he's decided that his best chance of avoiding prosecution is full cooperation with our investigation." The look of betrayal that crossed Richard's face was almost comical. His golden child, the son he'd elevated above everything else, had sold him out the moment it became advantageous to do so. "What did he tell you?" Richard asked weakly. "Everything," Uncle Harold answered. "About the septic tank, about the systematic abuse, about his active participation in keeping Natalie isolated and terrorized, about the parties where your friends knew what was happening and chose to ignore it." That last part was news to me, but I kept my expression neutral. Uncle Harold's investigators had apparently uncovered a broader pattern of complicity among the Brooks family's social circle. People who'd known about my treatment and done nothing to intervene. "Tyler also provided documentation," Marcus continued, pulling more papers from his briefcase. "Photographs he took of Natalie's living conditions, text messages where he bragged to friends about his parents, creative punishment methods, video footage from his phone showing some of the abuse." Richard collapsed into the chair like a man who'd been shot. "He recorded it?" "Extensively," Marcus confirmed. "Apparently, he thought it was entertaining enough to share with his friends. Unfortunately for you, those same recordings are now evidence in a criminal case." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Tyler had been documenting my abuse for his own amusement, turning my worst moments into entertainment for his social circle. The brother who'd seemed merely indifferent to my suffering had actually been an active participant in creating and preserving it. "Show me," I said quietly. Marcus hesitated, glancing at Uncle Harold, who nodded grimly. He handed me a tablet loaded with video files that made my hands shake just looking at the thumbnails. The first video was dated 3 years ago. Tyler had filmed me being dragged to the septic tank while providing commentary like a nature documentary narrator. "And here we see the wild Natalie in her natural habitat," his voice said over images of me being shoved into the concrete crawl space. "Observe how she struggles briefly before accepting her fate." The second video was worse. It showed me emerging after a week underground, filthy and disoriented, while Tyler interviewed my parents about their innovative parenting techniques. My father explained how isolation and sensory deprivation were more effective than traditional punishment, while my mother laughed about how much quieter the house was when I was in storage. I watched several more clips, each one documenting a different aspect of my systematic dehumanization. Tyler had turned my suffering into content, sharing it with friends who commented and laughed and suggested new forms of creative discipline. "How many people saw these?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "Based on the social media analysis, approximately 40 people across various platforms," Marcus answered, "all of whom are now potential witnesses, if this case goes to trial." Richard was staring at the tablet in horror, apparently realizing for the first time how thoroughly his family's crimes had been documented. Tyler said he deleted all of those. "Tyler lied," Uncle Harold said simply. "Just like you've been lying for years about Natalie's well-being, about the money I sent, about your fitness as parents." The meeting ended with Richard signing a modified plea agreement that included additional penalties for the videotaped evidence. The new terms required him to undergo psychological evaluation, complete a parenting education program he'd never need, and participate in a documentary about child abuse that Uncle Harold was funding. After he left, escorted by security, I sat alone in my office processing what I'd learned. The abuse had been worse than I'd remembered, more systematic and calculated. But more importantly, it had been preserved in detail, creating an irrefutable record that would prevent my family from ever rewriting history. "You're thinking too hard," Uncle Harold said, returning to the office with 3 cups of coffee. I can hear the gears grinding from the hallway. I accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth to steady my hands. "I'm thinking about Tyler. About the fact that he recorded everything." "What about it?" "He's not getting the same plea deal as my parents," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He was an adult for most of this. He actively participated, documented it, profited from the entertainment value. He should face the full consequences." Uncle Harold studied my face carefully. "That's a harder path. Tyler's cooperation has been valuable for building the case against your parents. If we prosecute him separately, we lose that advantage." "I don't care about the advantage," I replied. "I care about justice. And justice means Tyler facing consequences for what he did, not getting rewarded for betraying parents who are already defeated." Marcus nodded approvingly. "It's your choice, Natalie. You're the victim here, and your preferences carry weight with the prosecutor's office." Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into learning every aspect of Uncle Harold's business, while the legal case against my family moved forward. During the day, I studied waste treatment processes, environmental regulations, and client management techniques. During the evenings, I worked with investigators to build an airtight case against Tyler that would survive his inevitable attempts to claim he was just following orders. The business education was fascinating in ways I hadn't expected. Waste management wasn't just about collecting garbage and treating sewage. It was about understanding complex systems, managing environmental risks, and building relationships with clients who needed problems solved discreetly and efficiently. "Every business generates waste," Uncle Harold explained during one of our evening strategy sessions. "The companies that thrive are the ones that turn that waste into someone else's profit. We're not just disposing of their problems. We're creating value from what they can't use." The philosophy extended beyond literal waste. Uncle Harold had built his empire by identifying inefficiencies in other people's operations and offering solutions that turned costs into revenue streams. Industrial clients paid premium rates for waste processing that actually generated useful byproducts. Municipal contracts provided steady income while creating opportunities for expansion into related services. "The key," he continued, "is understanding that you're not really in the waste business. You're in the problem-solving business. People pay more for solutions than they do for simple disposal." I began to see how the same principle applied to my legal situation. Tyler wasn't just a criminal defendant. He was a problem that needed to be solved permanently, in a way that would prevent him from ever creating similar problems for anyone else. The solution came from an unexpected source. Carmen Walsh, Uncle Harold's business partner and the company's chief financial officer, had been quietly investigating Tyler's current activities while we focused on building the historical abuse case. "Your brother has been running a side business," she told me during a meeting in her downtown office. "Social media consulting for college students who want to build their personal brands." "What does that have to do with anything?" I asked. Carmen smiled, the expression of a woman who'd spent decades finding creative solutions to complex problems. He's been using the abuse videos as marketing material, showing potential clients how he can create viral content from unlikely source material. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Tyler hadn't just documented my abuse for his own entertainment. He'd turned it into a business model, proof of his ability to create engaging content from raw human suffering. He's been profiting from my abuse for 3 years, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. More than that, Carmen continued, pulling out financial records that showed Tyler's growing income from his consulting business. He's been using your story as a case study in viral marketing, teaching other people how to monetize family dysfunction. That's when I understood that Tyler wasn't just complicit in my abuse. He was actively exploiting it for ongoing financial gain, turning my worst experiences into a revenue stream that had helped fund his college education and lifestyle. The discovery changed everything about our legal strategy. Instead of pursuing simple criminal charges for historical abuse, we now had grounds for ongoing exploitation, copyright violation, and fraudulent business practices. Tyler had created a criminal enterprise based on my suffering, and that enterprise could be prosecuted under federal racketeering statutes. We can destroy him, Marcus explained during an emergency strategy meeting. Not just criminally, but civilly. We can seize his business assets, his client list, his intellectual property claims. We can make sure he never profits from your story again. Uncle Harold was more direct. We can make sure he learns what it feels like to lose everything because of someone else's choices. The legal machinery began moving with the efficiency of a well-designed waste processing system. Federal investigators seized Tyler's computers, his business records, his client communications. The abuse videos he'd been using as marketing materials became evidence in a federal case that carried potential sentences, measured in decades rather than years. My parents' plea agreements were restructured to include testimony against Tyler, completing their family's destruction while ensuring that each member faced consequences proportional to their crimes. Richard and Linda would serve minimal jail time, but would spend years rebuilding their lives from nothing. Tyler would likely spend the next phase of his adult life in federal prison, but the real satisfaction came from watching the business I was building grow stronger each day. Under Uncle Harold's guidance, I'd begun implementing expansion strategies that would double our capacity within 2 years. I'd identified new revenue streams, negotiated better contracts with existing clients, and developed relationships with regulatory agencies that would smooth future growth. "You have good instincts for this work," Uncle Harold told me as we reviewed quarterly projections. "Better than I expected." "It makes sense to me," I replied. "You take things other people can't handle and turn them into value. You solve problems that seem impossible to everyone else." He smiled, the expression of a man watching his life's work continue beyond his own involvement. "That's exactly right. And that's why this business will thrive long after I'm gone." Standing in my office that night, watching the treatment facility process another day's worth of industrial waste into profitable byproducts, I understood that I'd found more than just safety and security. I'd found a calling that transformed my worst experiences into my greatest strengths. My family had tried to break me by treating me like waste. Instead, they'd taught me how to turn waste into wealth, how to take the things other people couldn't handle and make them into something valuable. Tyler's trial was still months away, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was devastating, and the federal prosecutors were eager to make an example of someone who'd turned child abuse into a business model. Justice was coming for my family, but more importantly, I was building something that would last long after their punishment was complete. An empire built on solving other people's problems, powered by the knowledge that anything could be transformed if you understood its true value. The first attack came through our industrial clients. Someone had been calling our biggest accounts, spreading rumors about contamination issues and regulatory violations that didn't exist. 3 major contracts were suddenly under review, and our municipal partnership with Columbus was being questioned by city council members who'd never expressed concerns before. I was reviewing the financial impact when Carmen Walsh burst into my office without knocking, her usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency. "We have a problem," she said, dropping a thick manila folder on my desk. "Your family hired a crisis management firm, Not just any firm. Kellerman Associates. The name meant nothing to me, but Uncle Harold's reaction when Carmen called him into the office told me everything I needed to know. His face went gray, and he sank into the chair across from my desk like a man who'd just received terrible news. David Kellerman, he said slowly, specializes in destroying people who threaten his clients. Corporate whistleblowers, abuse survivors, journalists who dig too deep. He doesn't just defend against accusations, he systematically dismantles the accusers. Carmen opened the folder to reveal a coordinated campaign that was already in motion. Fake social media profiles spreading disinformation about Uncle Harold's business practices. Anonymous tips to regulatory agencies alleging safety violations. Carefully planted stories in local media suggesting that my abuse claims were motivated by greed rather than justice. They're not just fighting the criminal charges, Carmen explained. They're trying to destroy your credibility, Harold's business, and our ability to function as a company. The strategy was sophisticated and vicious. Rather than simply denying the abuse allegations, Kellerman had crafted a narrative where I was a disturbed young woman who'd been manipulated by my uncle's business rival into making false accusations for financial gain. The story portrayed Uncle Harold as a ruthless businessman who'd exploited family dysfunction to damage a competitor's reputation. "Look at this," Carmen said, pointing to a mock-up newspaper article. "They're claiming Harold never sent money for your care, that the financial records were fabricated, that you've been living with him for years, not months, and that the septic tank story was invented to justify a hostile takeover of your father's imaginary waste management business. The fictional narrative was internally consistent and designed to appeal to people's cynicism about family disputes and business rivalries. It positioned my parents as victims of corporate manipulation rather than perpetrators of child abuse." "How are they planning to distribute this?" I asked, studying the carefully crafted lies with professional admiration for their construction. "Traditional media, social platforms, regulatory agencies, law enforcement," Uncle Harold answered grimly. "Kellerman has contacts everywhere. By next week, half the state will believe you're a mentally unstable con artist who's been coached to destroy an innocent family." The timeline was accelerated by Tyler's upcoming federal trial. His defense team had clearly coordinated with Kellerman to create maximum chaos around the abuse allegations before the criminal case could proceed. If they could undermine my credibility completely, Tyler's federal charges might be reduced or dismissed entirely. "We need to respond," I said, my mind already working through countermeasures. "But not defensively. If they want to fight dirty, we need to be dirtier." Uncle Harold looked uncomfortable with the direction of my thinking. "Natalie, I understand you're angry, but we have legitimate legal channels. We don't need to stoop to their level." "Their level is where this fight is happening," I replied, studying the Kellerman materials more carefully. "Look at the sophistication of this campaign. Professional graphics, coordinated messaging, insider knowledge of regulatory processes. This isn't desperation. This is warfare." Carmen nodded approvingly. "What do you have in mind?" Over the next several hours, I outlined a response strategy that would have made Kellerman himself proud. Instead of defending against their allegations, we would launch our own investigation into the crisis management firm's methods and client list. Instead of denying their narrative, we would flood the information space with documented evidence that was impossible to dispute. "We have Tyler's videos," I pointed out. "Hours of footage showing systematic abuse, recorded by the perpetrator himself. We have financial records proving Uncle Harold's payments were real and substantial. We have medical documentation of my physical condition when he found me." "That's all evidence in ongoing criminal cases," Uncle Harold protested. "We can't just release it publicly." "We don't have to release it ourselves," I said, my strategy crystallizing as I spoke. "We just have to make sure the right journalists know it exists and understand how to access it through proper legal channels." The plan I developed wasn't just about defending our reputation. It was about systematically destroying Kellerman Associates' ability to operate by exposing their methods and client relationships. If we could demonstrate that they routinely fabricated evidence and manipulated media coverage on behalf of criminals, their entire business model would collapse. You're talking about taking on one of the most powerful crisis management firms in the country, Carmen warned. They have resources we can't match. They have money, I corrected. We have truth. And in the waste management business, you learn that truth is the only thing that can't be processed away. The first phase of our counterattack targeted Kellerman's weakest point, their reliance on anonymous sources and fabricated evidence. I had learned from Uncle Harold that successful waste management required understanding complex systems and identifying points of failure. Kellerman's system depended on controlling information flow, which meant they were vulnerable to information they couldn't control. Jake Morrison, our head of security, had connections throughout law enforcement who were interested in learning more about Kellerman's methods. Within days, we had copies of complaints filed against the firm by previous targets, documentation of their pattern of evidence fabrication, and contacts within regulatory agencies who were tired of processing obviously false reports. This is bigger than just your case, Jake explained during a briefing session. Kellerman has been pulling this same strategy for years. Regulatory agencies know his reports are usually garbage, but they have to investigate anyway. Law enforcement is frustrated with the resources they waste chasing his manufactured leads. The revelation opened up new possibilities for our response. Instead of fighting Kellerman's campaign against us, we could position ourselves as part of a broader effort to expose his corrupt practices. We weren't just defending against false allegations. We were helping law enforcement understand how those allegations were manufactured. We need someone with media experience, Uncle Harold said after reviewing our expanded strategy. Someone who understands how to work with journalists and regulatory agencies simultaneously. That's when Carmen suggested contacting Dr. Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist who'd been researching crisis management firms for a book about corporate disinformation campaigns. Dr. Martinez had been trying to penetrate Kellerman's operations for months without success. But our documentation of their methods against us provided exactly the inside access she needed. You have to understand, Dr. Martinez explained during our first meeting, Kellerman doesn't just defend clients. He destroys anyone who threatens them. Abuse survivors, whistleblowers, journalists like me. His methods are sophisticated, systematic, and usually effective. She showed us examples of previous campaigns where Kellerman had completely fabricated evidence of mental illness, financial impropriety, and criminal behavior to discredit his targets. The pattern was consistent: create alternative narratives that were internally coherent but factually false, then use professional relationships to disseminate those narratives through official channels. The genius of his system, Dr. Martinez continued, is that it doesn't rely on convincing everyone, it just has to create enough doubt to prevent decisive action. If half the people believe your abuse claims and half believe you're lying, then nothing happens to your abusers. Understanding Kellerman's strategy helped us develop countermeasures that were specifically designed to prevent ambiguity. Instead of trying to defend against false allegations, we would provide so much verified documentation that neutral parties would be forced to choose between obvious truth and obvious lies. The turning point came when Tyler's defense team made a strategic error. Confident that Kellerman's disinformation campaign was working, they filed a motion to dismiss the federal charges, based on allegations that the evidence against Tyler had been fabricated by Uncle Harold's business interests. The motion required them to present their alternative narrative in court, under oath, where it could be directly challenged with documented evidence. Within hours of the filing, Dr. Martinez had obtained copies through legal channels and was comparing their claims to the extensive documentation we'd provided. They're claiming the abuse videos were created with actors, Dr. Martinez told me over the phone. Professional productions designed to look like authentic family interactions. Can they prove that? I asked. They have to try, she replied, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. Which means they have to present evidence in court that contradicts medical records, financial documentation, and witness testimony. This motion is going to destroy their credibility completely. The federal judge's response to Tyler's motion was swift and devastating. Not only did he deny the request to dismiss charges, but he ordered an investigation into whether the defense had knowingly presented false evidence to the court. Kellerman's carefully crafted narrative was falling apart under legal scrutiny. Your brother just made a fatal mistake. Marcus Rivera explained after reviewing the court transcripts. He went from having a difficult but winnable case to facing potential perjury charges and sanctions for frivolous litigation. The collapse of Tyler's defense strategy created a cascade effect that exposed Kellerman's methods to broader scrutiny. Dr. Martinez published a detailed analysis of the disinformation campaign in a national magazine, using our case as a window into the crisis management industry's darker practices, corporate crisis management or criminal conspiracy. The headline read, followed by a comprehensive exposé of how firms like Kellerman's routinely fabricated evidence and manipulated media coverage to protect clients who should have been facing criminal prosecution. The article's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Regulatory agencies began reviewing previous complaints that had originated from Kellerman Associates. Law enforcement agencies started investigating cases where his reports had influenced their decisions. Media outlets began questioning whether they'd been manipulated by professional disinformation campaigns. Within a week, 3 of Kellerman's biggest clients had terminated their contracts. The firm's stock price plummeted as investors realized they were backing a company that might face federal prosecution for obstruction of justice. David Kellerman himself was forced to testify before a congressional committee investigating corporate influence on regulatory agencies. But the most satisfying development was watching my family's legal strategy collapse in real time. Without Kellerman's narrative management, they were left with the basic facts of their case. Documented evidence of systematic child abuse, financial fraud, and ongoing exploitation of my suffering for profit. Richard and Linda Brooks' plea agreements were restructured again, this time with significantly harsher terms that reflected their involvement in the Kellerman disinformation campaign. Tyler's federal trial was expedited, with additional charges added for conspiracy to obstruct justice and perjury. They overplayed their hand, Uncle Harold observed as we reviewed the latest legal developments. If they'd just accepted the original plea agreements, they would have avoided most of this additional scrutiny. They couldn't accept the original agreements, I replied, understanding my family's psychology better than he did. Because accepting them would have meant admitting they were wrong. And they've never been wrong about anything in their entire lives. The psychological insight proved prophetic. Even as their legal situation deteriorated daily, my parents continued to double down on increasingly desperate strategies. They fired their original lawyers and hired more aggressive representation. They attempted to file countersuits against Uncle Harold for defamation and against me for emotional distress. Each new legal filing made their situation worse by providing additional evidence of their refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. The judges handling their cases began imposing sanctions for frivolous litigation, and their new lawyers started withdrawing from representation as the cases became obviously unwinnable. Tyler's situation was even more desperate. The federal prosecutors had expanded their investigation to include his entire social media consulting business, uncovering a pattern of exploiting family dysfunction and personal trauma for commercial gain. His client list included other abuse survivors whose stories he'd helped monetize without their knowledge or consent. Your brother wasn't just exploiting your story, Carmen explained during a strategy meeting. He was running a systematic operation that identified vulnerable people and turned their trauma into viral content for profit. The revelation transformed Tyler's case from a relatively simple abuse and exploitation charge into a complex federal investigation involving multiple victims across several states. The sentences he was facing had expanded from years to decades, with potential restitution requirements that would prevent him from building wealth for the rest of his life. He could have avoided all of this, Marcus pointed out during one of our legal strategy sessions. The original plea agreement would have given him minimal jail time and a chance to rebuild his life. Now he's looking at federal prison until he's middle-aged. He couldn't take the plea, I said, echoing my earlier insight about my parents, because taking it would have meant admitting that I was worth protecting. And in the Brooks family hierarchy, that was never going to be possible. The waste management business had taught me that some materials can't be recycled or repurposed. Sometimes the only option is complete disposal, contained and isolated to prevent further contamination. My family had reached that point in their legal proceedings. They couldn't be reformed or rehabilitated because they couldn't acknowledge that reform was necessary. As winter turned to spring, Uncle Harold began transferring more operational control of the business to me. The crisis with my family had demonstrated my ability to think strategically under pressure, and the successful counterattack against Kellerman Associates had proven I could handle sophisticated opponents. Quote, "You have good instincts for this kind of work," he told me as we reviewed quarterly earnings that had actually improved during the legal battle. "Most people would have been overwhelmed by what Kellerman threw at us. You turned it into an opportunity." The opportunity he was referring to extended beyond just surviving the attack. Dr. Martinez's investigation had connected us with other businesses that had been targeted by similar disinformation campaigns, creating potential new client relationships. Our success in documenting and exposing corporate misconduct had attracted attention from companies that needed discreet waste management services with proven discretion and security. "We're not just processing waste anymore," I realized during a planning session for our expansion strategy. "We're processing problems that other people can't solve through normal channels." Uncle Harold smiled, the expression of a mentor watching his student grasp a fundamental truth. "That's always been the real business model. The waste is just the visible part. The valuable part is the trust that comes from solving problems that could destroy people if they were handled incorrectly." Standing in my office that night, watching the facility process another day's worth of industrial waste while my family's legal empire crumbled in courtrooms across the state, I understood that the battle had never really been about justice or revenge. It had been about transformation, about turning the worst experiences of my life into the foundation for something larger and more valuable than my abusers could have imagined. They had tried to break me by treating me like waste. Instead, they had taught me that anything could be transformed if you understood its true value and had the tools to process it correctly. The skills I'd learned in the septic tank, surviving in impossible conditions, finding value in what others discarded, understanding that the worst situations were temporary if you could endure them, had become the foundation for building an empire. Tyler's trial was still weeks away, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution was thorough, and the defense had destroyed its own credibility through desperation and overreach. Justice was coming for my family, delivered through the same systematic approach I'd learned to apply to waste management problems. But more importantly, I had built something that would outlast their punishment and their memory. An organization dedicated to solving problems that seemed impossible, powered by the understanding that the most toxic materials could be transformed into something valuable if you had the right processes and enough patience. My family had tried to dispose of me like waste. Instead, they had created someone who understood waste better than anyone else in the industry, someone who could turn their most desperate strategies against them with the efficiency of a well-designed treatment system. The final phase of their destruction was beginning, and I had the perfect vantage point to watch it unfold. Tyler's sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Uncle Harold had found me in that septic crawl space. I sat in the gallery wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than my family's monthly grocery budget, watching as my brother was led into the federal courthouse in shackles. The transformation was complete on both sides. Tyler, once the golden child athlete destined for greatness, now looked like what he'd always been underneath, a petty criminal who'd built his identity on cruelty. His shoulders were hunched with defeat, his expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his cocky smirk gone forever. I, meanwhile, had become someone my 17-year-old self could never have imagined. At 19, I was the majority owner of Midwest Waste Solutions, a company that processed over 40% of the industrial waste in 3 states. My net worth exceeded 8 figures, my business relationships spanned multiple industries, and my reputation for solving impossible problems had attracted clients from across the country. Judge Patricia Chen was known for harsh sentences in exploitation cases, and Tyler's hearing had drawn media attention because of the federal investigation into corporate disinformation campaigns. Dr. Martinez sat in the press section, preparing to write the final chapter of her exposé on Kellerman Associates, which had declared bankruptcy the previous month. "Mr. Brooks." Judge Chen began, You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, exploitation of minors, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say? Tyler stood shakily, his court-appointed lawyer having advised him that showing remorse might reduce his sentence. What came out of his mouth instead was the same entitled self-pity that had defined his entire life. "Your Honor, I was just trying to protect my family from false accusations," he said, his voice cracking with what he probably thought sounded like sincerity. "My sister has always been troubled, and my uncle used her against us for business reasons. I never meant for any of this to happen." Judge Chen's expression didn't change, but I could see the disgust in her eyes. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence, watched every video Tyler had recorded, read every social media post where he'd bragged about monetizing family trauma. His attempt at manipulation was transparent and pathetic. "Mr. Brooks," she said coldly, "I have spent considerable time reviewing the evidence in this case. The videos you recorded yourself show systematic abuse of your sister over multiple years. Your social media communications demonstrate that you not only participated in this abuse, but profited from it by teaching others how to exploit family dysfunction for entertainment." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "You have shown no genuine remorse for your actions, and your testimony during these proceedings has been consistently dishonest. The evidence shows that you continued to exploit your sister's trauma even after reaching adulthood, turning child abuse into a business model that you marketed to other young people." Tyler's face went pale as he realized his attempt at manipulation had backfired completely. "I hereby sentence you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to all identified victims of your social media consulting business, and you are permanently prohibited from creating content that exploits family relationships or personal trauma." The gavel came down with finality, and Tyler collapsed back into his chair as if he'd been shot. 12 years meant he'd be 30 when he was released, his athletic prime long gone, his social media career permanently destroyed, his reputation forever linked to child abuse and exploitation. But the sentence was more than just punishment. The restitution requirements meant that even after his release, Tyler would be working to pay back the people he'd exploited for the rest of his life. Every dollar he earned would be monitored, every business venture scrutinized, every attempt to rebuild blocked by the legal and financial consequences of his crimes. As the bailiffs led him away, Tyler looked back at me with an expression of pure hatred, as if this was somehow my fault rather than the natural consequence of his own choices. I met his gaze steadily, feeling nothing but the cold satisfaction that comes from watching a problem get properly disposed of. My parents had been sentenced the previous month in state court. Richard received 8 years for child abuse and financial fraud, while Linda got 6 years for conspiracy and failure to protect a minor. They'd been divorced during their legal proceedings, each trying unsuccessfully to blame the other for decisions they'd made together. The house where I'd grown up had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution, with the proceeds barely covering a fraction of what they owed. Both of my parents would be nearing retirement age when they were released, with no assets, no employment prospects, and criminal records that would prevent them from working in most industries. "Justice served," Carmen Walsh said as we left the courthouse together. "How does it feel?" I considered the question as we walked toward my car, a black Tesla that reflected my success as clearly as my clothes did. The pursuit of justice had taken over a year of my life, consumed millions of dollars in legal fees, and required me to relive the worst experiences of my childhood in courtrooms and depositions. "It feels like closure," I said finally. "Not satisfying exactly, but complete." The distinction was important. Revenge would have been satisfying in the moment, but ultimately empty. Justice was different. Justice meant ensuring that my family faced consequences proportional to their crimes, that other potential victims were protected, and that the systems that had enabled their behavior were reformed. The federal investigation into crisis management firms had led to new regulations governing corporate communications with regulatory agencies. 3 other firms besides Kellerman Associates had been forced to close or restructure their operations. Dr. Martinez's book had become a bestseller, raising public awareness about how disinformation campaigns targeted abuse survivors and whistleblowers. More importantly, for my long-term goals, the legal battle had established Midwest Waste Solutions as a company with uncompromising ethical standards and the resources to defend those standards against sophisticated attacks. Our client base had actually grown during the crisis, as other businesses recognized that we could handle complex problems with discretion and effectiveness. "Your uncle would be proud," Carmen continued as we reached my car. Uncle Harold had died peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier, after ensuring that all legal ownership of the company had been transferred to me. His funeral had been attended by hundreds of people, whose lives he'd touched through business relationships and quiet philanthropy. My parents and Tyler had not been permitted to attend per the terms of their restraining orders. His death had been difficult, but not devastating. Uncle Harold had spent his final months teaching me everything he knew about running a complex business, maintaining relationships with difficult clients, and building systems that could function independently of any single person's involvement. "He taught me that the waste management business is really about trust," I said, echoing one of his favorite lessons. "People pay premium rates for services they could get cheaper elsewhere because they trust you to handle problems that could destroy them if mismanaged." The principle had guided every decision I'd made since taking full control of the company. Rather than simply expanding our capacity or pursuing larger contracts, I'd focused on building a reputation for absolute reliability and discretion. Clients knew that anything they brought to Midwest Waste Solutions would be handled properly, legally, and permanently. That reputation had opened doors to opportunities that went far beyond traditional waste management. We now provided consulting services for companies dealing with environmental remediation, regulatory compliance, and crisis management. The irony of becoming a legitimate crisis management consultant after defeating Kellerman Associates wasn't lost on me. The drive back to my office took me through the industrial district, where Uncle Harold had first shown me the treatment facilities. The complex had doubled in size since then, with new buildings housing expanded processing capabilities and administrative offices for our growing staff. My personal office occupied the top floor of the newest building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a panoramic view of the operation. I could see every aspect of the business from my desk: trucks delivering industrial waste, processing facilities turning that waste into useful byproducts, and administrative buildings where contracts worth millions of dollars were negotiated daily. The view included the location where my family's house had once stood, now an empty lot overgrown with weeds. The property had been purchased by a development company that planned to build a shopping center, erasing the last physical evidence of the Brooks family's presence in Millbrook. "Natalie," my assistant's voice came through the intercom. "You have a call from Washington, someone from the Environmental Protection Agency, about the consultant position we discussed." The EPA position was the next phase of my long-term strategy. After building a successful business and establishing a reputation for ethical practices, I was being recruited for government service that would influence environmental policy on a national level. The appointment would give me access to regulatory frameworks that could shape the entire waste management industry. "Transfer it to my private line," I said, settling behind my desk to take the call that would determine whether I'd be moving to Washington within the year. The conversation lasted an hour and covered everything from my business experience to my vision for modernizing environmental regulations. The EPA official was particularly interested in my insights about corporate compliance and the role that private companies could play in enforcing environmental standards. "Ms. Brooks," the official said as the call concluded, "based on this conversation and your background materials, I'm prepared to recommend you for the position. The salary won't match what you're earning in private business, but the opportunity to influence policy could be significant." "I'm not motivated by salary," I replied, looking out at the facility that had become my life's work. "I'm interested in building systems that work properly and last beyond any individual's involvement." After the call ended, I sat alone in my office processing the magnitude of what my life had become. 5 years earlier, I'd been sleeping in a septic tank, believing that I was worthless and powerless. Today, I was being recruited for a federal position that could influence environmental policy for decades. The transformation hadn't been accidental or miraculous. It had been the result of systematic work, strategic thinking, and the understanding that any situation could be improved if you had the right tools and enough persistence. Uncle Harold had taught me that waste management was about more than processing unwanted materials. It was about understanding complex systems and building solutions that created value from what others couldn't handle. The same principles that made Midwest Waste Solutions successful had guided my approach to dealing with my family's crimes. Instead of simply seeking punishment, I'd focused on building comprehensive solutions that addressed root causes and prevented future problems. The result wasn't just justice for me, but systemic changes that would protect other potential victims. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Martinez, who was finishing her book tour and planning her next investigative project. Saw the sentencing coverage on the news. Your family story has already prevented 3 similar abuse cases that we know of. People are recognizing the warning signs and intervening earlier. The message was gratifying in a way that Tyler's prison sentence hadn't been. Individual punishment was important, but systemic change was what created lasting value. My family's crimes had been documented so thoroughly that they'd become a case study in recognizing and responding to child abuse. Social workers, teachers, and law enforcement officials were using our materials in training programs across the country. As evening approached, I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to build something valuable from materials that others had discarded. The EPA position would expand my scope and influence, but the fundamental work would remain the same, taking complex problems and creating systematic solutions. Walking through the facility on my way to the parking garage, I stopped to check on the evening shift operations. The processing plants hummed with activity, turning thousands of gallons of industrial waste into cleaned water and useful byproducts. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, their uniforms clean, and their safety equipment properly maintained. This was what Uncle Harold had really taught me to build. Not just a business, but a system that created value, protected people, and functioned according to principles that couldn't be corrupted or destroyed by individual bad actors. My family had tried to break me by treating me like waste, but they'd actually taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Anything could be transformed if you understood its true nature and had the tools to process it correctly. Standing in the facility that night, watching millions of dollars worth of equipment process problems that other people couldn't solve, I understood that I'd become exactly what Uncle Harold had envisioned. Not just a successful businesswoman, but someone who could take the worst situations and turn them into something valuable. My family was gone, processed out of my life as efficiently as any other toxic material. Tyler would spend the next 12 years learning what powerlessness felt like, while my parents rebuilt their lives from nothing, with the knowledge that their crimes had become a cautionary tale for generations of families. But their punishment was just the byproduct of something larger and more important. The real victory was the system I'd built, the problems I'd solved, and the understanding that no situation was so toxic that it couldn't be transformed with the right approach and enough patience. The drive home took me past the empty lot where my childhood home had stood, then through neighborhoods that had once seemed impossibly prosperous to a girl who slept next to raw sewage. Now I lived in one of those neighborhoods, in a house that was comfortable without being ostentatious, surrounded by neighbors who knew me as a successful businesswoman rather than the broken child I'd once been. At 24, I owned a company worth more than $50 million, employed over 200 people, and was being recruited for federal service that could influence environmental policy for decades. I'd turned the worst experiences of my life into the foundation for success that my abusers could never have imagined. But more importantly, I'd learned that transformation was always possible. Any situation, no matter how toxic or hopeless it seemed, could be processed into something valuable if you had the right tools and understood the underlying systems. My family had thought they were teaching me my place in their hierarchy. Instead, they'd taught me that waste was just an opportunity that other people didn't know how to recognize. They'd created someone who understood waste better than anyone else in the industry, someone who could turn their most desperate strategies against them with the efficiency of a well-designed treatment system. Tonight, as I prepared for sleep in a comfortable bed in a house I owned outright, I thought about the girl who'd once crouched in a septic tank, wondering if anyone would ever care what happened to her. That girl had been right to believe that her situation could change. She just hadn't understood that she would be the one to change it. The transformation was complete, the problems had been processed, and the system I'd built would continue creating value long after everyone involved in its creation was gone. My family had tried to dispose of me like waste. Instead, they'd created someone who understood that waste was just raw material, waiting for the right process to turn it into something valuable. Justice was served, business was thriving, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build something even better from whatever problems other people couldn't solve. The waste management business had taught me that everything could be transformed, and I'd proven that principle with my own life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.